right, welcome everyone. My name is Dr. Brian J. Griffith. I'm an assistant professor of European history at Fresno State in the Department of History. And today is the first of what I hope will be many book talks in conjunction with our department. Today, we'll be talking with and listening to a presentation by Dr. Carol Helstosky, who will be talking to us about her new book, Italian Forgers. Before we get into the presentation and the Q&A, I just want to go over a few meeting logistics with everyone, just so that we're all on the same page in terms of how the meeting will be structured. So following my brief professional introduction for Dr. Helstosky, she will deliver a 40 to 45-minute presentation on her new monograph, Italian Forgers, which will be followed by a Q&A session during the time that remains in our meeting, which should be substantial, maybe 25 to 30 minutes or so. If you have a question that you would like to ask Dr. Helstosky, you have two different options. You can write your question into the Q&A dialogue or the chat dialogue here in Zoom, and I will read that aloud for you. If you would just rather not, maybe you're not in the right Wi-Fi zone, or you would rather not appear in the recording, I would read that question aloud for you in the order in which it appears. Or if you would rather ask yourself, you can just raise your hand or indicate in the chat dialogue that you wish to ask a question, and I will call upon you in the order in which it appears for you to unmute yourself and ask your own question to Dr. Helstosky. Does that sound like a plan? All right, very good. So without further ado, let me introduce today's speaker. So Dr. Carol Helstosky is a social, cultural, and political historian of 19th and 20th century Italy, with an emphasis on the history of food production and consumerism under Benito Mussolini's 20-year dictatorship. Carol earned her doctorate in modern European history at Rutgers University and is currently serving as professor of European history at the University of Denver, where she teaches courses on modern Europe, modern Italy, and food history, among other topics. Dr. Helstosky is the author of really an impressive number of monographs, edited volumes, journal articles, and book chapters, including my personal favorite, Garlic and Oil, Politics and Food in Italy, published by Berg in 2004. Pizza, A Global History, published by Reaction in 2008. The edited volume, Food, Culture in the Mediterranean, published by Routledge in 2009. The edited volume, The Routledge History of Food, published by the same publisher in 2014. And of course, the subject of today's virtual meeting, Italian Forgers, the Art Market, and the Weight of the Past in Modern Italy, published by Cornell University Press just this year. If you would like to purchase a copy of Italian Forgers, I'm going to go ahead and punch into the chat dialogue here a link to Cornell University Press's website, along with a code. That code will give you a 30% discount on the book if you purchase it through the University Press's website. Carol's current research project, tentatively titled Soldiers in Italy, examines the presence of US military in Italy from the Second World War to the present. The project stems from her recent involvement in the Veterans Legacy Program, which is a multi-year contract with the VLP, the Veterans Legacy Program, to create a research-based curriculum and community-driven project around the lives and legacies of veterans buried at Fort Logan National Cemetery. The project, when completed, will chronicle the presence of US veterans in wartime and on military bases, focusing on the interactions between soldiers and Italians. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Carol Helstosky.
Thank you, Brian. And it's a real honor to be here to launch this series of book talks. I'd also like to give a special mention. This is meaningful to me. In the audience today is Professor Borton Painter, who, when I was a student at Trinity College in Hartford, Connecticut, I believe I took my first class in Italian history, right, which is medieval and Renaissance history, and to show how things sort of come around. A great deal of what I talk about in Italian Forgers, of course, is medieval and Renaissance art and history. So this, it's really amazing to me today that this comes full circle, and you never know, I suppose, when you're teaching where your influence goes. So thank you all for coming. I would first like to start, let's see what I can do about sharing the screen here. And I have a couple of slides, or I have many slides or several slides that I'd like to show everybody today. It's exciting also to talk about this book, which was just released, I believe, at the mid-May. So it's brand new, hot off the presses, so to speak. But this book is, and the subject is not a new subject to me. This book has had a very, very long life. We always have book ideas sitting in the back of our minds, or perhaps we scribble away an idea in a notebook or put it away on a laptop or an iPhone somewhere. For me, this book project and the idea for this book has had incredible staying power. And I think that's because it's built on two significant interests of mine as an intellectual and as an academic, and of course, as an Italian historian. One, this book focuses on Italian identity as something with a history. In shaping this book and putting this book together, I thought a great deal about the negative stereotypes pertaining to Italian identity, especially the stereotypes that Italians are deceptive or untrustworthy. This applied to the workings of the art and antiquities markets in the 19th and the 20th centuries. Italian artists were frequently branded as forgers. Italian art and antique dealers were described as being dishonest. The market in Italy was described as being full of essentially worthless objects. Warnings, and when I say warnings, I mean published warnings, things in journals, newspapers, magazines. Warnings about the Italian market appeared in many nations over time, over and over again, which indicated to me that there was steady criticism of Italians and sort of an active shaping there of stereotypes of Italians and their behaviors. But I also noted the frequency with which such warnings were issued. This indicated to me that non-Italians, right, the customers or the consumers, would read these published warnings over and over again, but they would travel to Italy to buy art and antiquities, despite the risks and the warnings over and over again. Identity formation is, of course, based on relationships and contingencies. And I started to wonder about how this particularly negative aspect of Italian identity, that of being a dishonest or deceptive person, was forged. And here I fully intend the pun. Second, the evidence from this book was assembled out of what I call unexpected sources. When looking at a topic like art forgery, especially in the 19th and early 20th centuries, this is before art forgers became big celebrities or had Netflix documentaries or Hulu documentaries made about them, you seldom have evidence from the forger or the dealer that outright states, I knowingly deceived people and this is how I did it. So you have to look in other places for evidence. For this project, this included some really obvious ones, like trade journals for antiquarians, court proceedings against presumed forgers, but it also included some less obvious ones. So I looked in people's diaries and memoirs. I looked at gossip and innuendo and not just factual information or material. I enjoy generally looking for less obvious sources. And I think this process or this interest of mine developed with my interest in food history, where I looked at sources frequently cataloged in the Italian libraries and archives as ephemera, the archival materials that no one looked through, at least not in recent memory, or the cheap cookbooks, for example, produced during Mussolini's reign. I find myself drawn over and over again to lesser known or unpopular sources. Years ago, I published an article on the presumed forger Giovanni Bastianini in the Journal of Modern History. After that, I fully intended to move ahead with this project, but a series of other projects, commitments, and grants to do other types of work and some health issues got in the way of a more focused work on the topic of art forgery. Also, the more that I thought about it, I began to think that maybe I didn't have that much to contribute when it came to the question of whether Bastianini and other Italian artists knowingly committed acts of forgery. There are still lots of debates about Bastianini and other Italian artists as to whether they knowingly deceived others. These debates are detailed, intense, and even passionate. And they reminded me of the debates that had been going on for decades regarding the Italian art and antiquities markets. Why did so many individuals care so much? Why did it matter that so many non-Italian experts and critics defined and condemned Italian artists as forgers? And then it hit me. The debates themselves, the ones about presumed forgeries, were fascinating in how much they tell us about Italian identity and how it is or isn't formed. I realized that the debates about forgery and forgery scandals also tell us a great deal about the scope and nature of the market in antiquity, which has always been popular, but it exploded in the middle of the 19th century and continued through the fascist era. Tourists, artists, art experts, museum representatives, and really, really rich people, most of whom were not Italian, all converged on Italy in order to buy objects, but also to have very specific types of experiences. The desires and actions of non-Italians had both positive and negative consequences for Italians, who may have been willing to part with a treasured family object or to assist with excavations, but ultimately who could not continue to meet what was overwhelming demand for meaningful objects from Italy's past. Moreover, those who came to Italy to purchase objects may have been excited or dazzled by Italy's artistic treasures, but they were also aware of Italy's political and economic limitations. Specifically, the new nation of Italy could do little to protect or control the flow of goods, while Italy's lackluster economy meant there was not a sizable Italian middle class to purchase these treasures, and non-Italian customers or consumers also thought that Italians would be grateful to get whatever payment or price they could get for valued objects. Whereas earlier waves of consumers, and right, they were consumers of Italian art for centuries, were usually content with copies or imitations of older works. Consumers in the mid-19th century forward had very different ideas about what aspects of art and objects should be valued. According to them, art should be authentic and should reflect the history of Italy, as well as what was known as the history of Western civilization more generally. There should also be a credible and engaging story surrounding the object for purchase. Authenticity as a marker of value became increasingly more significant as the 19th century progressed, particularly when museums, both small and large, sought to fill galleries and wings with sculptures, paintings, and religious objects from Italy's past. Museums seldom represented the power of an individual, but constituted forms of cultural power for cities, regions, and even nation states. Thus, as the Italian government was trying to figure out how many valued objects were in Italy and how to protect these objects, other nation states and wealthy individuals and organizations were simultaneously attempting to both challenge and manipulate those efforts. Italian participants in the art and antiquities market were frequently accused of misleading foreign buyers. Not surprisingly, forgery scandals repeatedly drew the world's attention to Italy at the height of foreign demand for all things Italian. And I want to talk about 3 artists today, but I'll talk first about 2 individual artists really stand out for the attention and controversy that they attracted when they were accused of forgery. The first I've already mentioned is Giovanni Bastianini, and the second is Alceo Dossena. Their lives and careers span Italian unification and almost a century after. Bastianini and Dossena attracted international attention when they were labeled forgers by the press, by critics, and by those individuals and organizations that purchased their work. During and after the public discussions of their works, each artist was explicitly referred to as a genius or an aristocrat among forgers, the implication here being that they possessed considerable talent, although their motives were openly questioned and their presumed guilt was frequently debated. Both of these artists were still alive when their works were labeled forgeries. Both of them produced work that was installed in prestigious museums outside of Italy as authentic objects created in the past. Both Bastianini and Dossena generated incredible controversy and international panic when they were discovered to be the authors of these works. And I think in a funny turn of, or curious or strange turn of events, when they confessed to being the authors of these contemporary objects, no one believed them. And that indicates that they were both sort of labeled forgers, that they had made these contemporary works, and then told that they couldn't have been forgers because they weren't good enough, right, to create these works. So they were sort of in a double bind there. Both Bastianini and Dossena struggled to practice and refine craftsmanship at times when authenticity and works of original genius were more valued than these anonymous works that were sort of technically very proficient and demonstrated great technical or craft-like skill. And I think both Bastianini and Dossena can be considered forgers in a different sense, perhaps in that the rumors and accusations that kind of swirled around them and their activities forged a particular but very unsavory aspect of Italian identity, that of the dishonest and unscrupulous Italian individual who was eager to profit off of Italy's past and also the art world's collective gullibility. So the forgery scandals surrounding these artists constitute sort of a framework in the book for telling a history of the Italian art market, dependent as it was on foreign opinion and also the buyer's willingness to suspend belief and trust. For me, forgery scandals were significant, not for what they revealed about the artist's intention to deceive others or not to deceive others, but what they revealed about the geopolitical and economic realities that shaped the market for art in antiquity in Italy. And forgery scandals, I would also add, are important for what they tell us about Italian identity formation. So what I would like to do for this talk is talk about Bastianini and Dossena and discuss the forgery scandals that swirled around them. And I would also like to introduce a third artist, Icilio Joni, who repeatedly tried to create a forgery scandal around his life and work, but failed to do so. After talking about these three artists, I'd like to offer some general observations about the book and what I think it does, and then take questions and comments. And I would certainly welcome them. Let us start with Giovanni Bastianini, shown here in a painted portrait from the middle of the 19th century. Giovanni Bastianini remains one of the most controversial figures in the world of 19th century Italian art. He originally started off, he lived in and around Florence, and he started off as a stone cutter. He later became a sculptor. He is known, he produced both reliefs and busts, and I think he's best known for his busts that were emulations of Renaissance busts. He worked both in marble and also in terracotta. And you may have seen several of his busts, especially if you've gone to the Victoria and Albert Museum, which I'll talk about in a minute. This is the marble bust of Piccarda Donati. It is on display most times at the Pitti Palace, owned by the Uffizi gallery. This one was purchased after Bastianini's death in an attempt to display him as a skilled copyist or imitator of Renaissance styles. This one is the bust or the marble bust of Lucrezia Donati, who adorns the cover of my book. And you notice in the cover, if you purchase the book, she's sort of giving the side eye to the book title, and that is fully intentional. Donati's bust is on display at the Victoria and Albert Museum. Once Bastianini was sort of unmasked as a forger, a lot of his work winds up at the V&A Museum, and it's to the point where I think in the 1880s and 1890s, they're being approached by all kinds of people who essentially want to unload a Bastianini on them. And they say, this is beautiful work, like it very much. If we had the money, we could buy more. But the V&A Museum literally buys dozens of Bastianinis because they are such good deals, I guess. And they are both on and off display at that museum. Here is another, this is a terracotta bust of Girolamo Savonarola, also owned and sometimes displayed at the V&A. Another Renaissance figure, Marsilio Ficino. And then this, the subject of much controversy and a huge international scandal or forgery affair, whatever you want to call it. This is Girolamo Benevieni. Bastianini became the subject of international controversy in the year 1867 when he claimed authorship of this bust. This bust was purchased in Florence, Italy, and eventually it went through sort of a whole series of dealers and was put in display at an international exhibition in Paris. It winds up in France, and then eventually, right, is displayed at the Louvre, right, sort of the most prestigious museum that there is, and it is displayed as a work of the Renaissance. Many people are debating, you know, who might have sculpted this bust, but people are pretty sure that this is from the Renaissance. Much has been written about Bastianini as a very clever and frustrated artist who may have consciously deceived others. The historical record, I think, is far less clear on the question of whether or not he intended to deceive others or whether he was the unwitting victim of an art dealer named Giovanni Freppa, who was a well-known art dealer in Florence. The 1867 debate over the authenticity of this particular bust, while not overtly labeling Bastianini as a forger, denies him the reputation for being an artist in his own right. And the debate is essentially waged between French periodicals and also Italian periodicals, going back and forth. Bastianini says, yes, this is my work. And the French say, no, this is too good. You couldn't possibly have done this, and so on and so forth. And then I think a challenge is issued to Bastianini. Well, if you did this, why don't you create some other busts and we can sort of compare them and see if you did indeed do this. Bastianini says, fair enough. And he starts on this project to create, excuse me, busts of the Caesars, right? Ancient Roman Caesars. And he doesn't get to finish it. It's almost Victorian-esque. He dies of a mysterious fever, right? As he is trying to complete those busts. And so no one ever knows whether he was able to do that or not. Although Bastianini dies a really short time after the Benevieni affair, his name and his reputation were immortalized, right, in numerous articles and book chapters for decades afterwards. These pieces that are written about him reveal a kind of pattern and a very detailed analysis of his complicity and the sale of his works as authentic relics from the Renaissance. Art experts in France maintain that Bastianini knowingly deceived others, while British experts stressed his victimization at the hands of his dealer, Giovanni Freppa. In Italy, Bastianini becomes something of a culture hero, as he embodied the Italian appreciation for and emulation of past artistic styles. Today, art historians still debate how much or how little Bastianini knew or understood about what happened to his sculptures once they left his studio. And in my book, I dissect or pull apart or analyze the Benevieni affair from the perspective of a historian. and that is the discovery of presumed forgeries by Bastianini is set within the context or the broader context of Italy's emergence as a political entity in Europe. The discovery of the Benevieni bust in the collection at the Louvre, and also the ensuing debate about whether a contemporary Italian was even capable of creating the work, is described and analyzed in terms of the political and also cultural tensions growing between France and Italy. Specifically, a number of Italian patriots questioned foreign claims to Italian art. These tensions were very much reflected in a power contest between Bastianini and his defenders on one side, and French critics and officials on the other. Italian critics questioned how Italian artworks were acquired for museums in France, Britain, and Germany. The 19th century witnessed a steady increase in the number of individual agents collecting on behalf of public museums. Art officials in the new Italian nation attempted to control the activities of various individuals, or at least limit the damage they inflicted on Italian collections. Questions remained, however, as to what the new government could do in order to preserve Italy's artistic heritage, while also encouraging contemporary cultural production. Because one of the big elements of the debate here is, why can't Italian artists compete with French artists and be recognized as contemporary artists? Instead, they are sort of seen as being locked into the past, right? Their greatness occurred during the Renaissance, perhaps during the medieval period, but not in the 19th century. So this debate emerges, and questions are raised about what it is that the new government in Italy could do to sort of preserve, protect, and move forward Italy's artistic heritage and sense of progress. And I think the dilemma that Italy faces, and the struggle, or the ongoing struggle on behalf of Bastianini's Italian defenders, right? They continue sort of defending his reputation and his work through the fascist era, that these sort of indicate to us that there is this ongoing effort to uphold and preserve his reputation as an artist, but not a forger. Now, in between Bastianini and Dossena is another artist, Icilio Joni, and he worked at the turn of the century, sort of very late 19th century into the early 20th century. And unlike Bastianini, who kind of wanted to be left alone, he didn't enjoy the limelight and all of the attention that was focused on him after the Benevieni affair. Joni was very different. Joni very consciously tried to create a scandal around his work. He even went so far, as I point out here, to publish his memoirs, which in Italian are referred to as memoirs of a painter of old pictures, right? That sort of indicates what he did. Curiously, this was translated into English as the rather drab Affairs of a Painter. And there's a whole story behind the publication of his memoirs that if you want to ask me in Q&A, I'd be more than happy to elaborate on. But in these memoirs, he claimed very openly that he made numerous imitations of older, his specialization was medieval work, some of which were exhibited in museums around the world. He also claimed that he had a working and professional relationship with Bernard Berenson, who he refers to in the memoirs by the anagram Somberin. It's very obvious who he's talking about. And he also talks about Berenson's wife in his memoirs. The references to Berenson are striking, right? Because Berenson at the time was one of the most famous, right, experts of Italian art at that time. Joni grew up in Siena, which was a city that had a reputation already for retrofitting architectural styles into suit varied historical representations, including, right, especially those from the medieval era. After he had some formal artistic training, I think he kept getting kicked out of art school, he worked in the business of restoration. And there he really refined some of his techniques. And he began to create new works in imitation of old ones, settling in on the medieval era, working first with book covers and then branching into more religious works, panels, and triptychs. And here I show you one of his medieval book covers. He produced these by the dozen, right? And took them and they were sold to dealers, and sold all around everywhere from Siena to Florence up through Venice. You could find these medieval book covers for sale. This is a book cover from the Beinecke Library in Yale. They had it for some time from a donor before they realized it was not authentic. Joni sold these book covers, for like not too much money. Certainly nothing that would indicate that it was incredibly valued from the medieval era. The whole point of these book covers is that he sold them on the cheap and made a very modest profit, if anything. And frequently when customers would come back and say, hey, I found out that this book cover or this painting was from you, his response, according to his memoirs, was, what do you expect? Because you didn't pay that much money. Did you really think this was an authentic item, right, from the medieval era? And here I show you is another beautiful gilt book cover here. This one owned by a private donor and then turned over to an auction house in France, where it recently sold for 3,000 euros. So I think that's significantly more expensive than when Joni ever sold these. And then again, some of his work, here we see Madonna and Child with Saints Mary Magdalene and Sebastian, was likely purchased around 1915, 1916, so sometime around World War I, by a famous dealer named Joseph Duveen, who you may have heard of, and then eventually made its way to the Robert Lehrman collection, and then was donated to the Metropolitan Museum of Art, where it was then discovered to not be authentic. Duveen being an associate of Bernard Berenson and also connected to Joni's memoirs. So those are his works. Just a few examples of them. The popularity of his work enabled Joni to open up his own workshop in Siena, which became a real magnet for artists and other cultural figures in the area. And at the height of his career, which is roughly between 1910 and say 1925, his workshop produced hundreds, perhaps some estimate maybe even thousands, right, of imitations. And you could find them for sale all over the place. American collector Frank Jewett Mather Jr. recalled that, again, at the height of his career, circa 1920, in Florence, he wrote, there was a moment, and this is a direct quote, there was a moment when I could stroll up and down the Via dei Fossi in Florence and have Joni's offered to me alternately as modern and as fine originals, according to the dealer's estimate of his own character and of my intelligence, end quote. Although his name was unknown to many buyers, Joni's work had international reach. It sold in both European capitals, capitals outside of Italy, and also sold in the United States. He very explicitly proclaimed that he never pretended his works were anything but tributes to past art forms, yet he also understood that his work was being marketed to foreign buyers, not as contemporary art or tributes to the past, but rather as authentic pieces from Italy's medieval past. In the last decades of the 19th century, shifts in thinking, this is sort of the period immediately preceding Joni's popularity or Joni's sort of height of his career, shifts in thinking about art and its relationship to the past really began to reshape the Italian art market. So I have a chapter here talking about how his memoirs and his ongoing relationship with Berenson and sort of the controversies there over the publication of his memoirs, how this reflects these dramatic shifts going on in the early 20th century. One of the biggest changes was, of course, art historical expertise, shifts from Italy to places like Britain, Germany, and the United States. We also see changes in consumer tastes. They broaden to encompass eras, not just the Renaissance, but also the medieval era. And we see, right, in the person of Bernard Berenson and others, the rise of the art connoisseur, who introduces sort of new elements of professional evaluation into the acts of purchase, right? And so many individuals who are now going over to Italy are not going by themselves or relying on their intuition or their taste. They're being accompanied by connoisseurs who, and these are non-Italians, who are telling them what to purchase and why. Toward the end of the 19th century, the pressure on the Italian market for art and antiquities was unrelenting, and it was spurred largely by the entry of more and more American buyers, as well as buyers from smaller museums that were all looking for works to add to their Italian wings. During these boom years, Icilio Joni grew increasingly bitter about American and foreign presence in Italy. At the same time, he and others continued to produce copies of medieval works sought by Italians and foreigners alike. His attempts to claim authorship of works in museums and private collections, and his insistence on his professional relationship with Bernard Berenson attracted very little public attention, however. So he tries to create a scandal but can't. Given the frenzied demand for Italy's past, copies, reproductions, and even forgeries became a means of coping with a market that was largely by this time out of control of the Italians. Thus, the non-scandal of Joni's confession tells us a great deal about this ongoing power imbalance between Italy and foreign consumers, as well as Italy's continued struggle to simultaneously cope with and potentially profit from the demand for the nation's past. And it should be pointed out that neither Bastianini nor Joni nor Dossena became very wealthy from any of what they did. So that there's a chapter on Joni, and then at the end, toward the end of the book, is a chapter on this individual, an artist named Alceo Dossena. At the same time that sort of Joni was trying to figure out in how to attract attention to himself and his work, the museum world internationally was whispering about possible fakes that were now in prominent locales like the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston or the Metropolitan Museum of Art in New York. The whispering campaign turned into a major forgery scandal with Italy at the center once it was discovered that this Roman artist, Alceo Dossena, had produced a number of works during and after the First World War. Dossena was an artist. He was a stone carver, initially from Cremona, Italy, and he settled in Rome after World War I. He worked, and he's known for working in a variety of media, everything from wood to stone, to clay to whatever. He also imitated many historical styles, and not just the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance and the Italian medieval era. He stretches back to ancient Greek sculpture and to Renaissance reliefs. Where Dossena becomes sort of different and where he really stands out is the scale, right, of the works that he produced. And here I show you this is a stone tomb, so it's big, right? This is the marble tomb of Maria Caterina Sabello, which is at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. This frequently, you'll see this in any book on art forgery. It's considered a forgery because for several reasons, but one that I find really interesting is if you look there at her feet, she doesn't have soles on her sandals, right? She has straps, but nothing on the bottom. And so people say, aha, this is how we know it is a forgery, which always makes me sort of question that. I'm not sure, like, did Dossena not understand what sandals were? Is this like some sort of issue? It was alleged that he was working off of a photograph which cut, right, a photograph of an older tomb that was cut off at the feet. And so he didn't quite know how to fix the feet, I guess you would say. So this is a really big work. And then he also, to show you some of his Greek work, he made some of these chore, right, or Greek statues which were imposing, right? This one bought and purchased by the Cleveland Museum of Art. He also made these huge stone Renaissance angels. These were significantly large works. This one here is about 61 inches tall. So that's big. He's not making small objects like book covers. Dossena is making, I think, right, the scale of his work is audacious. He's making pieces that would look very good, right, in museums. And so there's, again, while there's debate that goes on about Bastianini for sure, there's maybe less of a debate about Dossena because of, again, the scale and the intentionality of his work. Now, what's going on and what again, I'm not weighing in on the technicalities and what makes a good piece and what makes a forgery or how we interpret the soles of the sandals. I'm not involved in all of that. I leave that work to art historians. Instead, I'm interested in the history of the forgery debate or the forgery narrative that develops in the wake of discovery. American art experts here are key, right? Because a lot of this work is finding its way to the United States. And here we're talking about the 1920s into the 1930s. American art experts claim that they discovered Dossena, the forger, after launching an international investigation into potential US museums and what was going on there, and sort of a cleaning of house or house cleaning. Dossena maintained that he somehow discovered his works were being sold at very high prices, right, to American museums as originals and not as copies or imitations. He claimed that his dealer, Alfredo Fasoli, was asking him to put together contemporary works that would be displayed in American churches. So they had to be big, they had to be large, they had to be impressive. And that Dossena claimed that he didn't know what happened to them afterwards. He sued his dealer because he heard about the tremendous profits that were being made from his work, and Dossena was destitute. He really needed money. His dealer turned around and sued him for being an anti-fascist and for uttering anti-fascist things in his workshop. Thus began something called the Dossena affair in the press. It was described in both American and Italian newspapers in late fall, so November, through early winter, so late fall 1928 to early winter 1929. American audiences worried a great deal about the implications of buying one of Dossena's fakes, while also reassuring themselves that American experts had solved the mystery, right, of how these fakes were making their way into the United States. Italian journalists had a very sort of different take on this. They rather dryly observed that the Dossena affair had all the makings of a glamorous Hollywood film. That there were Italian underdogs and wealthy American museum collectors who were completely ignorant of what they were doing. So this debate sort of goes back and forth between American newspapers and Italian newspapers. It also becomes global, which is not a surprise given the extension of the Italian market, and litigious, right? Dossena sues his dealer, who then sues him back. What was supposed to be a contractual matter about payment and value in the trial focused on loyalties to Mussolini and the fascist regime. And so what transpires in the, this is not about, whether he faked it or not. The court trial is about loyalty to Mussolini. What transpires in court, if you think there's going to be this massive unveiling of who is the forger, that doesn't happen. It's about what you say about Mussolini. And so journalists aren't interested anymore after that. Instead, the forgery narratives really focus on the discovery of work in US museums. And so the race is on after 1928, right, to try to sort of unveil and unmask and make transparent what is happening there. These narratives always tend to reassure the public that deceitful dealers and artists would be discovered and publicized, right, and held up to public opinion. And that sort of has a way of, I argue, right, restoring American cultural power and faith in what has to be a really eccentric market by this time. Dossena's life and career tell us much about the shape of the art market during the fascist period in Italy. Once again, artists and dealers had to adjust to fascist art policies and export rules. And also we see here with the Great Depression, right, the Italian art market, or the golden age of the Italian art market, is drawing to a close. Italian cities lose a great deal of business to other European capitals. Fascist economic policies increase the risk involved in foreign transactions. And then last but not least, the technology of the X-ray, right, makes detection of forgeries much easier. So given waning demand and intense competition from other European capitals, Italian artists and dealers have to adjust their expectations and their practices. Dossena did not share the motivations of Bastianini, who sought to revive the Renaissance during the Risorgimento era. Instead, he turned out an astonishing number of objects of diverse styles in order to earn a living, and feeding a very specific and at times overwhelming demand for museum quality pieces. So this book uses, right, three artists and the scandals or the non-scandals that they created as the anchors for a broader narrative about the contours of the art and antiquities market in modern Italy. As you can see, right, they each had different intentions or goals, and art experts over the decades have had varying levels of confidence in whether they could call them forgers. But the scandals and debates that erupted around their work function as a very good measure of the development of the art and antiquities market in Italy. I think, given time constraints, I'll stop there if that's okay, Brian, and stop sharing screen, and then we can take questions or comments if folks have them.
Indeed. Thank you so much for that really fascinating and thought-provoking presentation on this book. As we begin this Q&A portion of today's session, I just want to remind everyone of the two different options that you have for participating in Q&A. If you would prefer to ask your question yourself, of course, cognizant of the live recording that we have ongoing, please either indicate in the chat dialogue or by raising your virtual hand, and I will take you in the order in which your request appears. The second option you have, if you would rather not turn your audio on, or if you're just not in the position to participate in that capacity, is just writing your question out in the chat dialogue, and I will see that and will read out the question for you in the order in which they appear, okay? So either way, just let me know if you would like to participate, and I will try to get to everyone in the time that we have left. Before we get to our first question, I just want to acknowledge I have so many questions of my own. I think I've written down like 7 or 8 questions, which I know full well most of those will be sent in an email to you after our meeting, because we'll probably have quite a bit of participation. But I think your, this research project has really brought up a lot of parallels in my mind with my own research and with wider questions in our field. And so I think in that regard, it's a very useful study. Great. So I'm going to start with Dr. Danny Kim. He writes, I was wondering if part of the debate over whether Bastianini's works were intentional forgeries or unique artistic products that were exploited by his dealer in theory might be resolved through formal analysis. My assumption is that if all of his sculptures exhibited some kind of formal conformity, which were indicative of his own style, quote unquote, these works might be independent expressions of his own aesthetic vision. However, if his style varied across time to adhere to the tastes of a public hungry for art from the antiquity and medieval periods, then it might suggest that he was indeed a forger. And then he continues, looking at the third bust, it seems quite different formally from his other works. And to my untrained eye, it seems like his sculptures don't exhibit a singular unitary style, which might suggest that he was more of a forger than an artist. So your thoughts on that?
There are many. I think, one, there is a formalistic, right, art historical debate about the qualities of the busts. And I think there's, for example, there's an art historian, Anita Moskowitz, who has published a great many articles and even a book, right, defending him as an artist in his own right and not a forger. And so there's all kinds of stuff. Those who argue in the art historical world that he was a forger don't really talk. I mean, this is interesting to me. At least the contemporary ones, they don't talk very much about the technicalities, right? And sort of what the busts look like and how they might sort of look different from each other. So I certainly appreciate that question. They make their arguments on the dealers that Bastianini worked with, in particular Giovanni Freppa, and the kinds of things that he does, because this whole controversy starts where Bastianini is commissioned by Freppa to make this bust of Benevieni, right? And it's not for very much money. And Freppa doubles the profit, right? And I'm sorry, I can't remember what it was, but let's say it's like let's say it's 300 francs, right? And he sells it for 600. He doesn't, that's not considered a ton of additional money. And the reason for that is with dealers, commercial fraud laws in Italy at the time of the Risorgimento indicated it was perfectly okay to make what was called a reasonable profit from a sale, but to make sort of a huge amount of money or an extreme amount of money was considered perpetrating commercial fraud. So art historians look not at what the busts are looking like or how they might look different from each other, but who the dealer knew and what his relationships were. I'll also point out that it seems to me, and I think the historical record demonstrates, that Freppa and Bastianini would get together and say, hey, I don't think anyone's done a bust of Benevieni before. Like there's maybe there's a portrait of him, but there's no bust. Let's try it. And Bastianini would hire people in his neighborhood to pose for him, and sort of look like you're in the Renaissance or something like that. And they would just be sort of workers or other tradesmen or whatever they were doing. On the technical details, though, what's really interesting about the Benevieni debate is that the French, Bastianini is very proud of what he does, and he studies the Renaissance, and he knows what Renaissance artists do to create busts. And so he's very proud of the bust that he's put together. And the French examine the bust, all over the place, and they say, look, there are these tiny holes, right, in the hairline that were drilled, right, and that's a mark of the Renaissance. And so they argue. The French argue for authenticity because there's no way the French were fooled by Italians, you see. And Bastianini always counters with, yeah, the holes are drilled there because that's how they did it in the Renaissance, right? This is how I did it. So there's this huge debate that I don't know if this is even answering your question, but there's so many different layers there, right? About what the busts look like in formal terms, how they're put together, that can be interpreted either way, which is why I think we'll never know for certain about Bastianini, right? He left behind no evidence to suggest that he knew what was happening.
Fascinating. Great. Just an invitation again to everyone out there. If you have any questions, go ahead and type them in or indicate otherwise that you would like to speak. I think I'll take my turn if you don't mind, Carol.
Mm-hmm.
One of the first things that occurred to me when I was reading over your book was this broader debate in our historiographical literature about not only the place of Italy in the modern world, but the perception of Italy from Northern Europeans and more broadly, Americans during the 18th and 19th centuries. So I'm kind of channeling here two different books that come to mind. The first is Nelson Moe's The View from Vesuvius. And the second is, selfishly, my former PhD mentor, Claudio Fogu's recent book, The Fishing Net and the Spiderweb, both of which really engage with the place, like sort of the imaginary place of Italy and Italians within the minds of foreigners, right? And usually in a kind of derogatory tone. And so I wanted to see if you had anything that you can elaborate on with respect to the parallels between the art forgery market and perceptions of Italy and Italians, but specifically from foreigners.
Yeah, I mean, that's yes, yes. And I was very inspired by all those who are writing about it. And I think it's really important to tackle the negative stereotyping. And I think for me, reading something like Silvana Patriarca's work, right, and saying, oh wow, like what's going on here, and then reading in her work, this was much earlier, right, than Claudio Fugu's or other works, but she's writing about how Italians were then engaging with those ideas and what they were doing with those negative stereotypes. And so I thought a lot about that. And I think it's what's interesting to me and what I see happening is a very, what I call them the modern antiquarians, right? This entire industry that develops around the negative stereotypes, right? That these people are ignorant, they don't know what they have that's valuable, and you could sort of go in there and have your way and get what I call inexpensive authenticity, because they don't know any better, right? And they would just bury the stuff in the dirt and not care about it, right? Like, and so what does that say about the foreign visitors to Italy and their perception of art? And certainly there's been a couple of books very recently, like I think Joanna Smalzerts has written a very interesting work about the 19th century and all of these efforts to smuggle works out, right? Because as the new Italian nation tries to control import and export, well, mostly export out of Italy, people are trying to get around those laws, right? And they're doing all kinds of things, and they are enlisting Italian assistance for that. Um, Italians play into some of these negative stereotypes, and I'll give you a very specific example. One of the big things is, of course, planting a work that perhaps is not authentic or is not worth very much, in the home or the palace or the apartment of an Italian who is down on their luck, right, or not wealthy, losing money, and has to part with valued objects. So it plays into the whole sort of stereotypical narrative about, right, declining economic possibilities in Italy and a declining aristocracy, but the whole thing's created, right? So the customer comes in and is like, I love that piece that's on the wall, totally want to buy this. But the Italians have sort of created, right, the whole frame or the narrative of this negative stereotype, right? Like it plays into these negative stereotypes for the purpose of the sale. So, and I think that also happens in dealer shops too. And it used to be the case where customers in much of certainly the 18th and the early 19th century would go with an Italian guide to many of these shops. And then you begin to see the Italian guides being replaced by, right, non-Italians who come around, like the connoisseur who's going to move them all through Italy. But when the Italian guide goes in, they go into a studio and there are, paintings stacked up against a wall or propped up against a wall. And they're in the process of being, right, restored. And the dealer will show the foreign customer a couple of paintings and say, we have this, this, and this. Do you like these? And they won't be that spectacular. But whatever's in the corner will be really fantastic. And so the customer will say, I want that one. He's like, oh, I can't give you that one. That one's being restored for, let's say the customer is British, right? That's being restored for an American. And the British customer gets really, competitive and wants what the American has. And they say, the Italians go, no, you can't have this. So he goes back to his hotel, and then, oh my goodness, a day later, he's called and told, like, the American backed out of the deal or whatever. Do you want this, right? So there's a lot of work that I talk about, that of framing purchase and I talk about the experience of purchase is as important as the object itself, right? The story of how this happens and what it means, because you're not just buying the object, but you're buying the whole history behind the object, or what you think is the history behind the object. And I have considerable amount of attention in the book paid to what I call as the modern antiquarian industry, where they're really trying to promote this, right, selling of objects from the past as a very modern and profitable industry.
Right, right. Fascinating. And a fascinating anecdote about the tactics for sale that you just shared. Very good. Again, if anyone has any questions, just chime in through the chat dialogue. Oh, good. We have a question here from Lynn Blanchfield.
Hi, Carol.
Lynn,
Nice to see you.
yeah, good to see you.
Yeah, it's been a while. In any case, my question stems, you partially answered it about the rising consumerism in the late 19th and early 20th century. And it reminded me, I don't know if any of you get the New Yorker, but there was a great cartoon on the cover of a New Yorker a while ago where a woman has like a Gucci bag and this beautiful beautiful earrings, and of course she's very, very wealthy. And then right behind her are people selling knockoffs behind her of the exact earrings and the exact bag that she's carrying, right? So your comment earlier about the first artist whose name escapes me, about, these people who are buying book covers for very, very cheap and saying, well, what do you expect? Of course, you can't buy this, this thing for a lot of money. Why are you claiming to be duped when in fact, you're not spending a lot of money on it? And I'm wondering if you could comment on not only more about the rise of consumerism, but I'm also thinking about the late 19th century economy of Italy. That what else are they selling in the late 19th century, right? People are fleeing, especially in the South. They're going everywhere because there's so much poverty, at least in the South. So can you comment a little bit more about this rise of consumerism and what's going on with Italy's economy at this time, and why, what else does Italy have to sell besides its patrimony, right, at this time to make any money?
Right. I mean, one of the biggest contributors to the Italian economy is, of course, immigrant remittances, right? Because people are voting with their feet and they're leaving and they're sending money back home. So again, what are the opportunities, right, that are there? We see this in the history, right, of the mafia, right, creating economic opportunities out of which there are none in a stagnating economy. So Italy's economy isn't as advanced, right, as the economies of the countries that these tourists are coming from. And you have folks like J.P. Morgan, who I understand had quite a bit of money, right, coming over to take advantage of the Italian economic situation. So yes, consumerism in the sense that you have increasing numbers of tourists, some very wealthy, but also by the end of the 19th century and into the 20th century, more and more, I guess you call them upper middle class tourists, who are taking, packaged tours and going on ships across the Atlantic or from wherever, who want a certain kind of good, but they can't afford really big, expensive, valuable works. So the Italian market has to expand or flex to accommodate what they want. And so you begin to see all of this stuff. People disparagingly call it bric-a-brac, right? That's not so valuable, but it fits their pocketbooks. The Italian art and antiquities markets really are, I think, not only very sort of self-conscious about what they're doing, but they're incredibly sophisticated, right? That they are able to sell goods at a much lower price. Now, as to your question about what does this ultimately contribute to the Italian economy, is it able to pull the economy forward? I can't really answer that, because I don't, again, I think most of the antiquarians are fine. They want to stay within legal limits, right? They don't want to sort of breach laws about fraud. So they're not selling it for huge profits, right? That goes to other dealers, maybe in Paris, right? Maybe in New York, maybe in London, who market these goods as being, these are authentic items. And there you see the cost of something triple or quadruple, right, or quintuple, right? And that's the whole point of the Benevieni bust, is that it's in Paris that it suddenly increases not by hundreds of francs, but thousands of francs, right? Until it's purchased for a really outrageous sum. So there's something, this economic imbalance really feeds and sustains this kind of market, even as more and more people, in terms of being consumers, come in and want to participate in this market. Nice to see you, Lynn. Did that answer your question?
Great. Next, we have Carl Ibsen, who writes, do you look by any chance at discussions of the Italian art world in works of fiction? Nathan Hawthorne's Marble Faun and Sontag's Volcano Lover come to mind. And he follows up with, and I guess you talk about new Italian legislation after unification on forgery.
Yeah, I chose to, those are great questions. I chose to really discuss the three artists that form the anchor, because I've been thinking about, forgery versus forgery narratives. But there are sections where I talk about how the situation that the new Italian government faces after unification is if we think about it, is extraordinary, right? They set off to try to do an inventory, right, of valuable work in Italy, and all you need to do is think about, oh my goodness, like how much would that be, right? What's in the possession of individual families? What's in the possession of churches? What's in the possession of municipalities? At the same time that they're trying to sort of figure out what they have, they're also trying to figure out what can be done to protect, right, these works, and they're trying to figure out how to build a museum network, right? That would be both for tourists, but also if we think about nation building for Italians, right? For Italians to begin to understand their history, right, and their cultural contributions. So the new Italian state certainly has its hands full. It doesn't have resources to do much, to do a good job on any of this stuff, right? It's really strapped for resources. So it can't. Its inability to either figure out how much is there, and more importantly, to protect what is there, again, feeds into some of these purchase narratives of purchase, right? Like if a foreign customer could come in and get something, right, really cheap, and we're going to get around customs, we're going to send it out on a boat, or we're going to put a false front on this authentic Renaissance painting, and it'll go by customs officials without issue. This becomes part of the sale, so to speak. And Italians are certainly, some Italians are in on it. But more importantly, foreign customers are all there saying we need to take advantage of a new nation state and a new government that is completely unable to protect anything. And some of that feeds into assumptions that, okay, because Italians can't take care of this stuff for themselves, we'll just help ourselves because we can do a better job. All right. And the book is full of these quotes of people who want to bring, like entire chapels back, back to Britain or whatever, because the Italians can't take care of it. And then there's this other question, which I find really interesting, is when we ask about forgeries, why are there no laws against it, right? And how tricky is that to clamp down on art forgery? It shouldn't be that hard, but I found out by looking into laws that are set up after unification, it is really hard. But interestingly, many antiquarians constantly weigh in on these laws, and the idea is that, again, they're fine selling stuff for not a big profit, for a very modest profit. So whatever they can do legally to ensure that that continues to happen, they advocate for. So they publish all kinds of pamphlets and books and things like that, and have their own professional, right, trade journals to sort of keep track of what the new state is doing. And it will go through, in the book are several progressions, right? The Rosati law and other laws that are put in place to protect, right, antiquities in Italy's patrimony. And yes, there are certainly a lot of novelistic treatments. I think about the Golden Bowl all the time, about what exactly it is that you're buying or you're purchasing when you go to purchase a piece, but also Hawthorne as well. And then many authors who come to Italy and find it, right, find the situation to be, in their words, disgraceful, that Italians don't care about their past, and that this is awful because this is something, what used to be called Western civilization we should all protect. I hope that answered your questions.
Great. So given the time, I think I'll close out our session with a reminder and also one final question. So the reminder is going into the chat dialogue. This is, again, a link to Italian Forgers on Cornell University Press's website, along with the code that will give you a 30% off discount. And my final question, Carol, is one of my favorite questions to ask as a closing question to these types of book talks, which has to do with, the magic of the archive. It's one of my favorite things about being an historian is being in an archive and being in that act of, well, a combination between sort of educated guessing and sort of magical discovery, where, oftentimes when you're looking for a certain thing, a certain type of document, or you're hunting for a certain, category of source, you stumble upon things that you didn't expect, which kind of affects the outcome, the new course that the research project takes. So I wonder if you have any stories from your archival journey for this book, moments of discovery, maybe difficulties in tracing a source, tracing a lead, unexpected discoveries, things of that nature that you can offer us.
Yes, I think one of my favorite sources for the book that really sort of turned things around, again, like I said, I didn't have much to contribute to the question of whether these individuals had actually forged things, right? I wasn't able to find that evidence. That evidence doesn't exist, likely. But as I was looking, I remember I think it was the Florence National Library in Florence, stumbled across, right, this trade journal for antiquarians called The Antiquarian. And it was a revelation for me that these were folks, like I always thought about antiquarians as being, individuals who collected stuff and knew things about local history. And I hadn't thought about them as modern, as progressive, as, sort of moving forward and really trying to promote, according to a professional standard, right, their profession. And that was just delightful to look through. I think it's now digitized, so anyone can look at it from the comfort of their own laptop. But it was revelatory for me to try to sort of reframe what was going on and understanding what a close and professional and modern network of individuals this was. And that was something I just wasn't considering.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.